Hello, my name is Rebecca Mast, and I am here today with Dr. Aaliyah Hoffman, and we are going to be talking about healthy habits for healthy calves. And so, Aaliyah, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you give us just a little bit of background about who you are and what your role is here at Worldwide Sires?
Yeah, my name is Aaliyah Hoffman. I'm a veterinarian. I work with the Worldwide Sires Global Training Center and also travel with the Global Dairy Solutions. I also work as a veterinarian here in Washington State with dairies.
Great. Well, thank you. And it's really good to have you as part of our team. And I hope that more of our team members around the world will have a chance to meet you. But it's great for them also to have a face behind the name as they read some of the articles that you have written over the years. And one of the things that you've done a lot of work with is calves and calf health and helping producers to develop a good program for their calves. So, when you're doing this, can you tell us what are the five most important things that you think of when you're talking about calves and a good calf program?
Yeah, happy to be here talking about calves. So there are lots of different calf raising systems that can be successful. Lots of different types of housing, types of feeding, but what they all have in common is really attention to detail in five general areas, and that's colostrum, cleanliness, the calories, consistency, and calf comfort.
Just to go through those, I think it'd be really helpful to go through step by step. So, the first one that you mentioned was colostrum. And maybe can you tell us a little bit about what you look for when you're talking about colostrum?
Yeah, so we like to make sure that colostrum is being tested before being fed to calves we recommend using a Brix refractometer and only feeding colostrum that's 22 or above for that first feeding, because that tells us it has an adequate concentration of antibodies to give the calf a good start to their immune system. We also want to make sure that that actual dose of antibodies is enough. And that means feeding at least 4 liters, feeding 4 liters of colostrum to Holsteins and 3 liters for Jerseys. And if we can follow up again with a second feeding in about 8 hours of colostrum, that can be really helpful too. And we want to make sure that the timing is right, that we're feeding colostrum within the first few hours after the calf is born to make sure that they get the maximum absorption of antibodies.
So sometimes what people will typically do with their calves is leave them with the cow and let them nurse on the cow. Is that a good way to make sure that a calf is getting colostrum, or what would be some of your concerns that you might have with that?
Yeah, so what many studies and experience has found is that oftentimes calves don't nurse quite enough colostrum to get the amount that they need. Um, So what we prefer to make sure that the calf does get that adequate amount is to milk the cow. Also, as soon as possible to make sure we have the highest concentration of antibodies, and then to just go ahead and feed the calf to make sure that we know how much the calf is getting.
Yeah, because then you can really control that volume that the calf is getting. You can also control the cleanliness because you don't have them nursing on a dirty cow. You make sure that it gets in there in time. Now, what about for herds that maybe don't have the ability to test the colostrum? Is there any way that they can help make sure that they're getting good quality? Obviously, testing is the best solution, but if they can't test it, are there other things that they can do as far as looking at the colostrum or the age of the cow or anything like that that can be helpful?
There are some other techniques like a colostrometer that kind of floats in the colostrum. They are not as accurate as the Brix. And really, both older cows and younger cows can have high quality colostrum, and we just don't know that unless we test. Um, There are options for a digital refractometer that are more expensive, but there are also options that are less expensive for just a light Brix refractometer that can also be used to read the colostrum. But I mean, generally, what you can see is that if there's any blood or mastitis, for sure you don't want to use that colostrum.
Mm-hmm. So in those cases, if you see blood or mastitis in the colostrum, maybe do you feed colostrum from another cow that's been frozen or something like that instead?
Yes, we like to keep a store of frozen colostrum just in case a cow doesn't produce enough for her calf, or there is an issue like that, mastitis or blood, to be able to use that frozen colostrum can be really helpful.
Yeah.
There are also colostrum replacers that as a fresh colostrum tends to be the best, but there are replacers that can do a very good job as well.
So timing and quality, really important. Testing whenever possible to confirm the quality, but making sure that you're getting that volume in the calf by actually feeding it and not just allowing the calf to nurse.
Yes. Another really important thing is cleanliness, which kind of brings us to the next point.
Yeah. And cleanliness, when you're talking about that, you're talking about where the cow is when it's being born, when the calf is being born.
So there's a few different points about cleanliness. One of those is where the calf is being born. So we want the maternity area to be clean. We want to disinfect the navel of the calf to make sure bacteria aren't entering that way. And like you had already mentioned, removing the calf from the cow can help us to ensure that the calf is in a clean environment. There's also aspects of keeping the colostrum itself clean. And that is really important because bacteria in the colostrum can bind up those antibodies and make them unavailable to the calf. So any equipment that we use to milk the cow, store colostrum, feed colostrum, we need to make sure that that is being really, really kept really, really clean. So I like to think about it like our calf feeding area and our colostrum feeding area. We need to think about it like a restaurant for people, where it has to meet very high standards for cleanliness so that the calves don't get sick directly from that bacteria, and so that we don't bind up those antibodies that are so important for calf health.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about colostrum, I mean, there's a lot of fat in it. It's kind of like a sticky consistency. So if we're not using hot water and some sort of detergent or disinfectant, it's going to be really hard to get that clean.
Yes. So you want to think about all the same steps that we use to clean the milking parlor. So we need a rinse with just warm water to get most of the stuff off of there. We want to clean it with a brush and a detergent to get all that fat out, and rinse it again, and then use a disinfectant as well, like an acid or bleach, to get it sanitized.
Mm-hmm. And all of this is so that the quality of that colostrum is the best, and that the calf can actually absorb all of the valuable antibodies.
Correct.
Yeah. And I think, sometimes people can think, oh, well, this is really complicated. And the example that you used of cleaning it like you would, or even better than you would your dishes, is really important. I mean, we want it to be at least that clean for the calves because these are newborns.
Yes, and honestly, dish soap works great. If that's what you have, just dish soap and bleach, clean everything really good, just like you're doing the dishes, and just have a bleach rinse at the end. Let it dry with that bleach rinse still on it, and that works really well.
Yeah, great. So those simple, practical things, just to make sure that we're always getting that quality, because you go through all the effort of milking the cow, you want to make sure that what you're delivering to the calf is the high quality as well.
Absolutely.
So also in relation to cleanliness, things like temperature matter.
Yes. So when we're thinking about bacteria in colostrum or milk, we know that bacteria multiplies rapidly when the temperature is right. So we want to, if we're going to store colostrum, like we talked about freezing colostrum, or even if you just want to store it in the fridge for up to 1 day, we need to cool it down quickly. Just putting it right from the cow into the fridge, it takes many hours to cool down. So put it in the freezer for a little bit, or use an ice water bath to get it colder. Use a container with a lot of surface area. These kinds of things really help to cool it down and stop that bacterial growth. And same thing when we're warming it up. So colostrum should never just be sitting out if it's not actively getting colder or getting warmer. Once we take it out of the freezer or the fridge, then we want to warm it up to feeding temperature, but not in too hot of water, because if we use water that's above about 60 Celsius, it can actually destroy some of those antibodies. You're basically cooking it instead of just warming it up. And we want to preserve those antibodies for the absorption.
Mhm. So this is for cases where you're storing the colostrum and then you're using that because you found that the cow who just gave birth had mastitis or had blood in her milk or colostrum or something. And so we're using this kind of as a replacer for what would be the fresh colostrum.
Yeah, either that, or some farms find it easier to just always use stored colostrum. And that's a little bit faster to make sure that you get colostrum to that calf. If you don't have time to milk the cow and collect the colostrum, you can still just warm up some stored colostrum and feed the calf.
Yeah, so then you get it within that window a bit quicker if you don't have to be waiting to milk the cow.
Exactly.
Got it. So next you mentioned calories, and this I think gets into the volume of milk that we're feeding after colostrum. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. The volume, and then also if we're using a milk replacer, making sure that that's a milk replacer with adequate amount of protein, especially, is really important. So if we're whole milk is a great feed for calves, and if we're feeding milk replacer, we like to see like a 26% protein and 20% or more fat in that milk replacer. And for Holsteins, they should be getting about 8 liters per day to get a sufficient amount for both maintenance, for their immune system, and for growth. This time when calves are on milk is a really efficient growth time for them. So we want to take full advantage of that by feeding them to their full growth potential at that time.
And do you give water and concentrates, and all of that at this time as well? Because we need their whole digestive system and especially their rumen to be developing.
Yeah, so we like to start offering water and starter grain in the first few days of life. So by 3 days of age, they should have water and starter available at all times. The starter they won't eat very much of, but just having a little handful in front of them allows them to kind of pick at it, start learning that it's something that tastes good. And we want to refresh that often so that it is always a fresh, good smelling starter that's in front of those calves. And then as they start to eat more, as they grow and they get bigger and have a higher energy demand, but they're getting the same amount of milk, they'll start eating more of that starter to make up the difference. And that's what helps to develop their rumen and allow them to wean well.
Mhm, mhm. And what's water important for?
So there's a lot of water in milk, but if the calves are starting to eat grain, they also need the water to support that and keep them hydrated. Lots of calves get scours, get diarrhea, and having that extra water is really important for keeping them from getting dehydrated. So it's been shown in many studies that water availability and freshness and cleanliness really impacts how much starter they will eat. So having that water available is really important to get them eating more grain, which in turn is really important for having a successful weaning time.
Yeah. And that growth coming at the right time and making the most of that time period when you said this is where they're really growing the most.
Yes, yes.
So great. So then the other C that you mentioned was consistency. What different things are we looking at when we talk about consistency?
Yeah, so consistency is a lot about milk feeding and how we feed milk. And this is so important because changes in the percent solids in the milk, changes in the quantity that the calves get from day to day, changes in the temperature from feeding to feeding, changes in when they're fed. If those things are not consistent, it can lead to more digestive problems, more scours, more issues with digestion for those calves. So the milk replacer, if we're feeding milk replacer, should be mixed really carefully, carefully measuring the amount of powder and the amount of water, mixing it very thoroughly so that there aren't portions of it that are more concentrated than other portions of it. Those things can be really helpful for keeping calves healthy.
Yeah. And that same time, temperature, all of those things are what help to make sure that their digestion stays the same.
Yes.
And then they're receiving, going back to the previous one, they're receiving a consistent amount of calories for that growth. So the final C that you talked about was comfort. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you think of when you see comfortable calves.
Yeah, so this is a pretty broad category. And again, it's not about having a particular facility. It's about paying attention to the details in whatever facility you have. And that means having bedding that's clean and dry and deep enough to keep them warm if it's cold weather. It also means having good airflow and good ventilation, and then just keeping everything clean between calves so we're not passing bacteria and viruses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that, that reminder that we can do this in all types of different systems. It doesn't require that it's a really fancy system, but it's making sure that these principles are being followed no matter what type of building or environment it is.
Yep.
These are the same principles.